They laughed when they saw what he carried. Steel helmets, automatic rifles, machine guns chewing through forests. And in the middle of it all, one man stepped forward with a weapon that belonged in a museum. A bow. Not a prototype. Not a trick. Not a symbol. A real, handcrafted medieval longbow. The soldiers whispered that he was suicidal. Officers thought he was unstable. The enemy didn't even bother to fear him. 3 days later, 7 German sergeants were dead, and no one ever mocked that bow again. Because the forest learned something ancient that week. Modern war does not erase old weapons. It only forgets how terrifying silence can be. This is not a legend. This is not propaganda. This happened, and what followed turned a forgotten weapon into a psychological nightmare. The forest didn't sound like war. No engines, no artillery, no shouting commands. Just wind-brushing pine needles and the slow, careful breath of men who knew they were being hunted, even though they didn't know by what. The German patrol moved in a staggered line, boots sinking softly into damp soil. Each man scanned the shadows with trained eyes, rifles raised, fingers disciplined. These were not recruits. These were experienced NCOs, sergeants hardened by campaigns across Europe. They expected resistance. They expected mines. They expected ambushes. They did not expect silence. The first sound came not as a shot, but as a dull, hollow thump. Organic, wrong, and intimate. The rear sergeant dropped without a scream. At first, no one understood why. No muzzle flash. No report. No echo. Just a man collapsing as if his body had decided to stop obeying gravity. When they turned him over, confusion rippled through the patrol. There was no bullet wound. Only a deep puncture beneath the collarbone, the shaft already snapped clean. Intentionally broken so it couldn't be traced, removed, or reused. The men froze. This wasn't Soviet. This wasn't British doctrine. This wasn't American. This was something older. The patrol leader ordered a defensive circle. Fingers tightened. Eyes darted upward into branches that suddenly felt too dense, too layered, too alive. That was when the second man fell. Closer this time. The arrow came from above, angled downward with calculated precision, striking through the soft tissue behind the ear. An anatomical kill that required intimate knowledge of the human body. Whoever was doing this wasn't guessing. He had practiced. Hours earlier, far behind Allied lines, the man with the bow had been told, again, that he was wasting time. The quartermaster had laughed openly. Another soldier had asked if he planned to frighten the Germans to death. The man said nothing. He never explained that firearms made noise, and noise invited retaliation. He never explained that ammunition ran out, but skill did not. He never explained that fear spreads faster when no one understands the weapon. He had learned this long before the war. Before uniforms. Before ranks. Before ideology. He moved through the forest now like a shadow with a pulse, counting heartbeats between breaths, calculating wind drift not for bullets but for feathers. Each arrow was handcrafted. Balanced. Tuned. Marked not with insignia, but with memory. He didn't aim for quantity. He aimed for certainty. The third sergeant died, trying to shout a warning. The arrow entered his open mouth, severing the spinal column before the sound could form. The forest swallowed the body before the word ever existed. Panic began to fracture discipline. Orders overlapped. Shadows moved where none had before. Every snapping branch became an attacker. They fired blindly into trees. The man with the bow didn't move. He waited. Firearms reveal position. Fear reveals weakness. He selected targets carefully, leaders first. Men with chevrons. Men others looked to when uncertainty crept in. Because once leadership dies, structure follows. And once structure breaks, survival becomes individual. By nightfall, 4 sergeants were dead. No gunfire confirmed the kills. No radio call explained them. No enemy was seen. Only bodies and arrows that vanished with their owner. Command would later write reports calling it unconventional enemy harassment. Survivors would call it something else. They would say the forest was alive. They would say the trees whispered. They would say death arrived without warning or sound. They would say, it felt medieval. And this was only the beginning. By dawn, the forest had changed. Not in appearance, but in behavior. Birds avoided certain trees. Wind moved strangely, as if detouring around invisible pressure. Even the insects seemed quieter, as though something ancient had reclaimed authority over the ground. The German response was predictable and useless. Reinforcements arrived with confidence born of numbers. Machine guns were set up to rake the tree line. Flares were prepared to turn night into day. Orders were barked with sharp certainty, meant to crush fear back into discipline. They still believed they were facing a man. They were wrong. They were facing a method. The first mistake was noise. Metal clanged. Boots shifted. A flare gun misfired and hissed before igniting. In that brief moment of human error, the bowstring sang, soft, almost polite. A sergeant fell, with an arrow embedded cleanly through his thigh, pinning him to a fallen log. Not a killing shot. A message. His screams echoed far longer than gunfire ever would. When two soldiers rushed to pull him free, arrows came again, one snapping into a wrist, another piercing a shoulder joint with surgical accuracy. Still no deaths. Just incapacitation. Fear began to rot into confusion. Why wound instead of kill? The answer arrived when the medics were hit. The bowmen understood something that war manuals never taught. Pain multiplies manpower. One wounded man requires 2 to carry him. 2 wounded require 4. 4 wounded break an entire unit's momentum, and every scream tells the forest exactly where to aim next. The Germans tried suppressive fire. Bullets shredded bark. Leaves exploded into green mist. Branches snapped and fell, but the arrows kept coming, always from a different angle, always silent until impact. This wasn't hunting. This was harassment by design. Hours later, command issued a direct order: burn the forest edge. Flamethrowers advanced cautiously, their operators sweating inside heavy gear, nerves stretched thin. Fire bloomed outward, devouring underbrush, hissing as moisture turned to steam. For a moment, it worked. The forest screamed back. Smoke rose thick and choking, distorting vision, bending light. The bowman retreated deeper, not in panic, but in preparation. He knew fire was loud. Fire announced itself. Fire made men predictable. The flames revealed silhouettes, soldiers exposed by their own tactics. And when the fire slowed, when fuel ran low, when confidence crept back, the bow returned. This time, the kills were fast. An arrow slipped beneath a helmet rim, slicing through the artery no steel protected. Another took a man through the eye as he turned, the feathered end vibrating briefly before going still. No warning, no sound, no mercy. By sunset of the second day, German patrols refused to advance without overwhelming numbers. Even then, they bunched together unconsciously, backs nearly touching, afraid to separate. That made it easier. The bowmen began using distance not just for safety but for terror. Arrows landed near boots. Quivers rattled branches overhead. Shadows moved where no body followed. He wanted them to feel watched. Because fear isn't loud. Fear waits. Reports sent up the chain of command grew erratic. Words like unknown weapon, primitive, and psychological disturbance appeared more often than coordinates. One officer wrote a line that would later be censored. The enemy does not fight like a soldier. He fights like the forest itself. On the third morning, the 7th sergeant arrived. Veteran. Decorated. Confident. He laughed at the reports. Called them excuses. Promised to end the embarrassment personally. He never fired his rifle. The arrow struck from below, angled upward through soft ground concealment, piercing lung and heart in one clean motion. He fell without expression, as if surprised, not by pain, but by realization. The forest went quiet again. 7 sergeants. 3 days. 1 weapon dismissed as obsolete. By the time command ordered a full withdrawal from the area, the damage was already done, not just in bodies, but in belief. Because modern war depends on certainty. And certainty had been killed. Silently. The bowman disappeared the way he had arrived. No trail, no spent casings, no proof he was ever there. Only empty ground, broken arrows snapped and removed, and a unit that would never again enter a forest without remembering. Sometimes the oldest weapons don't need improvement. They only need patience. The forest was cleared on the maps. A thick red line was drawn through it, followed by a short note written in careful military language. Area unsuitable for continued operations. No explanation, no after-action report worthy of detail. No medals awarded to the dead. Officially, nothing unusual had happened. Unofficially, everything had. The surviving German soldiers did not speak openly about those 3 days. When pressed, they used vague phrases. Confusion in wooded terrain, unidentified enemy harassment, poor visibility. But at night, when discipline loosened and cigarettes burned low, fragments of the truth escaped. They spoke of arrows that came without warning, of silence that felt intentional, of a presence that never rushed, never panicked, never revealed itself. Some swore they heard breathing above them in the trees. Others claimed the arrows came from the ground itself. One man insisted he saw the attacker once, just a shape wrapped in dark cloth, face streaked with mud and ash, eyes reflecting light like an animal's. When he raised his rifle, the shape was gone. Command dismissed these accounts as combat stress, but orders quietly changed. Patrols were told to avoid dense woodland whenever possible. Units entering forests were instructed to deploy overwhelming force or not enter at all. Snipers were reassigned from open terrain to tree cover, despite poor visibility. No one said why. On the Allied side, the man with the bow returned without ceremony. He didn't bring trophies. He didn't tell stories. He turned in what little equipment he'd been issued and stored the bow himself, cleaning it with the same care others reserved for rifles. No one asked him how many he'd killed. They didn't want to know. There was an unspoken understanding that some methods worked best when they stayed unexamined. His superiors filed the mission under irregular reconnaissance support and moved on. But the ripple had already spread. Enemy movement patterns shifted. Supply routes detoured miles out of their way. Units hesitated where speed once mattered. All because of a weapon they believed belonged to history books. The bowman was never officially recognized. There was no citation for bravery, no photograph, no name attached to the incident. Records that mentioned him were thin, deliberately vague, and later lost among thousands of similar files. That was intentional, because his success raised uncomfortable questions. What else had been forgotten? What other obsolete tools still worked? What did modern war overlook because it assumed progress made everything before it irrelevant? The bow returned to storage. The forest reclaimed its scars. New battles demanded attention. But among those who had been there, on both sides, something lingered. A lesson older than gunpowder. Technology changes how wars are fought. Fear decides who survives them. And fear doesn't care how old the weapon is. It only cares that it works. The forest never appeared in training manuals. New recruits were taught about rifles, machine guns, artillery coordination, air support. They memorized diagrams of modern killing. They were shown films of efficiency, how fast, how loud, how overwhelming victory should be. No one taught them what to do when the enemy didn't announce himself. But veterans remembered. When units rotated through the sector months later, older soldiers gave quiet advice that never made it into briefings. Stay out of the trees after dusk. Don't walk the same trail twice. If it's too quiet, stop. Officers pretended not to hear, yet maps kept their red line. The forest remained officially low priority, an empty space between objectives that supply convoys detoured around, even when it cost fuel and time. Engineers recommended clearing it completely, but requests stalled. Resources were needed elsewhere, excuses said. The truth was simpler. No one wanted to wake whatever had lived there. On the Allied side, the bowman was reassigned, not because his method failed, but because it succeeded too well. His presence created questions command didn't want asked. War relied on predictability, on systems that could be scaled and explained. A man with a bow didn't fit that structure. He was sent where silence mattered, where radios failed, where maps lied, and in each place the pattern repeated. Not always death, sometimes just disruption. Supply lines hesitated, patrols slowed. Enemy forces overestimated resistance and delayed attacks that might have succeeded. The bow was never mentioned. Only outcomes were. Long after the war, analysts would notice anomalies in archived documents. Operations that stalled without clear cause. Units that reported pressure but no contact. Terrain marked as hostile without recorded engagement. They would blame weather, or morale, or logistics. They would never blame a medieval weapon, because the idea was uncomfortable. It suggested that progress didn't replace the past, it layered over it. That beneath radar and engines and steel, the fundamentals of fear and vulnerability still ruled. And fear didn't need bullets. Years later, when the bowman was gone and the forest had grown thick again, locals told stories without names. Of soldiers who refused to enter certain woods. Of paths that animals avoided. Of places where sound seemed to travel differently. Historians dismissed them as folklore. But some truths survive best when they're whispered. Because if written plainly, they force a question no modern army likes to answer. What happens when the enemy stops fighting the way you expect? The war moved on. Cities burned. Empires fell. Yet somewhere between strategy and superstition, a lesson remained, quiet, sharp, and patient. Not everything deadly belongs to the future. And not every victory is loud enough to remember. Years passed, and the war consumed itself the way all wars do. Louder battles, larger numbers, faster machines. The forest incident faded into the background noise of history, buried under headlines of tanks and bombers and cities reduced to ash. But the men who had been there carried it forward. Some returned home and never hunted again. Some refused to walk wooded trails alone. Some woke at night convinced they heard something moving just out of sight. They had survived artillery. They had survived gunfire. What stayed with them was silence. In post-war interrogations, a few German veterans were asked about morale breakdowns during forest operations. Their answers were cautious, carefully worded, as if even decades later the subject demanded respect. One man said, "We could fight soldiers. We could fight machines, but we could not fight what we could not locate." Another admitted that after those days, every tree looked like a threat. Every shadow felt intentional. That fear followed them into later battles. Reaction times slowed. Patrol spacing tightened. Ammunition was wasted on empty darkness. Command blamed nerves. Psychologists blamed exhaustion. None of them blamed the bow, because blaming it meant admitting something worse, that modern war had failed to fully conquer the primitive instincts it was built on. On the Allied side, the bowman never spoke publicly. He declined interviews. He avoided reunions. When asked once why he never carried a rifle during those operations, he answered simply, "Rifles make war louder than it needs to be." That line never appeared in print. By the time historians began digging into unconventional tactics of World War II, most physical evidence was gone. The arrows had been removed, the trees regrown, the files misfiled or destroyed. All that remained were gaps, moments where expected resistance never appeared, units that stalled without explanation, forests that altered campaigns without firing a single shot. Some researchers suggested psychological warfare. Others proposed exaggerated survivor memory. But a few, very few, noticed something else. That casualties clustered around leadership. That deaths occurred without corresponding ammunition expenditure. That fear, not firepower, did most of the work. They didn't publish those theories. Academic careers depend on safe conclusions. And the idea that a medieval weapon could still shape modern war was anything but safe. The bowman died quietly, years after the war ended. No honors, no ceremony. His belongings were divided, his bow likely discarded or forgotten, mistaken for a relic with no place in the present. Which was fitting, because his greatest weapon had never been the bow itself. It was the refusal to fight the way the enemy expected. And that lesson, dangerous, uncomfortable, and deeply human, was never written into doctrine. It was learned the hard way, in silence. The war ended the way wars always do, on paper first. Signatures, dates, declarations that the killing had stopped. But memory doesn't follow orders. Long after the front lines dissolved and uniforms were folded away, the effects of those 3 days in the forest lingered in places no archive could catalog. In military academies, instructors spoke about adaptability without naming examples. About asymmetric thinking. About how dominance collapses the moment an opponent refuses to play by the rules you've mastered. They never mentioned bows. Yet students were warned about silence. About terrain that thinks for itself. About the danger of assuming progress equals safety. Some lessons were too unsettling to credit to a single man with an ancient weapon, because acknowledging him meant admitting that technology doesn't guarantee control, only confidence. And confidence is fragile. In later conflicts, when patrols slowed in dense jungle or special units chose knives over rifles in close quarters, no one traced the lineage back to that forgotten forest. But it was there, in every operation where stealth mattered more than firepower, in every mission where fear was used as a force multiplier. In every decision to strike leaders first, not armies, the bowman had not rewritten warfare. He had reminded it of something it tried to forget. That war, at its core, is not about weapons, it's about belief. Belief that you are safe. Belief that you understand the threat. Belief that the enemy will announce himself. The moment those beliefs die, panic takes their place. 7 German sergeants learned that in 3 days. Not because they were careless, not because they were weak, but because they trusted the future too much and ignored the past entirely. The bow never returned to battle. It didn't need to. Its work was finished the moment laughter turned into caution, and caution turned into fear. And somewhere in the quiet spaces of history, where no medals shine and no records survive, that lesson still waits. Sharp, silent, patient. Just like the weapon they mocked, time did what bullets could not. It erased names. Years after the surrender, archives were reopened, reorganized, and sanitized. Reports were trimmed. Language softened. Anything that hinted at panic, confusion, or humiliation was reframed as environmental difficulty or unfavorable conditions. The forest became a footnote, yet patterns don't disappear just because paperwork does. A small circle of post-war analysts, men tasked with studying failures rather than victories, noticed something strange when comparing unit behavior across multiple fronts. In several unrelated regions, enemy movement slowed dramatically after brief, inexplicable incidents in wooded terrain. No heavy fighting. No major engagements. Just hesitation. Delays measured not in minutes, but in days. In each case, leadership casualties spiked early. Communication broke down. Morale reports showed an unusual rise in what they carefully labeled anticipatory stress, fear that arrived before contact. The analysts argued quietly that something else had happened. Something that didn't fit the mechanized model of war everyone wanted to believe in. They never reached a consensus, because accepting their theory meant admitting that modern armies could still be manipulated by ancient methods, by silence, by patience, by weapons that didn't announce themselves with fire and smoke. And that idea threatened budgets, doctrine, and pride. So the findings were shelved. Meanwhile, soldiers who had never seen the bowman still felt his influence without knowing its source. They inherited caution from veterans, superstitions passed down as, quote, experience, habits that had no official explanation but were followed anyway. Don't linger under trees. Change routes without reason. Trust your instincts when the forest goes quiet. These weren't taught as rules. They were taught as survival. The forest itself changed too. Paths overgrew. Burn scars vanished beneath new life. What had once been a place of fear became ordinary again, to civilians at least. But some places remember. Hunters reported odd sensations. Hikers felt watched. Animals avoided certain clearings for no obvious reason. Nothing dangerous. Nothing measurable. Just a persistent discomfort, as if the ground had learned something and chosen not to forget it. The Bowman story was never officially told, but it lived on in fragments. Half-remembered warnings, red lines on maps, unexplained gaps in operational logic. History often celebrates what is loud and visible. It struggles with what works quietly, and the quietest victories are often the most disturbing because they suggest that beneath all our advancements, the rules never truly changed. Only our assumptions did. At some point, the man disappeared completely, and the idea replaced him. That was the moment the story became more dangerous than the weapon. Without a name, without a face, the Bowman stopped being a soldier and became a possibility. A rumor that couldn't be disproved. A threat that didn't need to be present to influence behavior. German units operating near forests began reporting pressure, even when nothing happened. Patrol leaders adjusted routes based on instinct alone. Recon missions requested air cover for areas where no enemy had ever been confirmed. The absence itself became suspicious. Fear no longer required evidence. That was the Bowman's final effect. Not the kills, not the disruption, but the creation of doubt. And doubt is contagious. Once doubt enters a unit, every decision slows. Every order is second-guessed. Every shadow demands attention. In war, hesitation is often more lethal than aggression. The irony was brutal. The Bowman no longer needed to act. His reputation did the work for him. Allied intelligence noticed it too. Movement patterns changed. Defensive positions shifted away from optimal terrain. Opportunities appeared where none should have existed. Victories came easier, not because of superior firepower, but because the enemy expected something unseen to strike at any moment. Yet command resisted acknowledging the source. They spoke of psychological degradation and terrain denial effects. They praised flexibility and initiative. They avoided specifics, because if they admitted the truth, they would have to admit something else. That one individual, using a weapon written off centuries ago, had altered enemy behavior more effectively than entire battalions. And that was unacceptable. So the Bowman remained unofficial. No doctrine carried his lessons directly. No field manual mentioned arrows. No medal recorded his contribution. But the myth grew anyway. By the end of the war, stories circulated among soldiers on both sides, each version more exaggerated than the last. Some said there were multiple men. Others claimed traps, poisoned arrows, even supernatural elements. The truth was simpler and more unsettling. It was just a man who understood fear better than most, and understood that war isn't won only by killing, but by controlling what the enemy believes is possible. When the war finally ended, the myth didn't. It settled into the margins of history, where uncomfortable truths tend to hide. Waiting. After the war, silence became official. Files were sealed. Testimonies scattered. The few officers who knew more than they should learned quickly that some stories were better left untouched. Not because they were classified, but because they challenged the story everyone wanted to believe about progress, control, and superiority. The myth of the Bowman survived only where paperwork couldn't reach. In memory, veterans passed it down indirectly, stripped of detail but heavy with warning. A story told without dates, without places, without names, always framed as a lesson, never as an event. Don't underestimate what looks outdated. Never assume the enemy will fight your war. Silence can be a weapon. These weren't philosophies. They were confessions. Military historians who stumbled across fragmented references often dismiss them as exaggeration. A coping mechanism. Soldiers romanticizing chaos after surviving it. The idea that 7 trained German sergeants could be eliminated by a bow in modern war seemed implausible, almost embarrassing. And embarrassment is the fastest way to erase truth. Yet the numbers never quite aligned. Leadership losses without corresponding firefights. Units rerouted without strategic necessity. Zones avoided without official threat assessments. Something had happened. Something that didn't fit the narrative of tanks and planes and industry. In private letters, never meant for archives, some German veterans admitted what reports never did. That they had been afraid not of death, but of helplessness. Of being hunted without understanding how. Of realizing that all their training meant nothing if the enemy refused to be seen. One letter, written years later, ended with a sentence that historians still argue over. It felt like the forest had chosen a side. The bowman never corrected the myth. If he were still alive to read it, he likely wouldn't have tried. Because myths do what weapons cannot. They spread without effort. They multiply without resources. They persist long after the last arrow is gone. By the time later generations studied World War II, the incident was gone entirely, reduced to a statistical anomaly, buried under louder victories and cleaner explanations. But war has a way of preserving what matters, not in books, not in medals, but in behavior. And behavior had changed. When the last archives were opened and the last witnesses were gone, the forest finally returned to being just a forest. No markers, no warnings, no graves with names. Children would one day walk those paths without fear. Animals reclaimed the clearings. Rain erased what fire and boots had scarred. Nature did what history often tries to do, cover what makes people uncomfortable. And yet, the war never fully took the bowman with it, because his story was never about the bow. It was about refusal. Refusal to fight loudly. Refusal to fight predictably. Refusal to believe that newer automatically meant better. 7 German sergeants died in 3 days, not because they were careless, but because they trusted rules that no longer applied. They trusted that threats announced themselves. That danger makes noise. That progress makes the past irrelevant. The bowman proved otherwise. He proved that fear doesn't evolve, it waits. That silence still kills confidence faster than gunfire. That control collapses the moment certainty does. World War II ended with cities in ruins and machines counted by the millions. Histories were written around factories, generals, and firepower. That made sense. Those were things that could be measured. What happened in that forest could not. It left no photographs worth printing, no weapons to display, no victories easy to explain. Only a change in behavior. Only hesitation where confidence once lived. Only silence where orders used to echo. And maybe that's why the story survived at all. Because the most dangerous lessons of war are rarely the loud ones. They are the ones that whisper. They are the ones that remind us that beneath armor, beneath technology, beneath doctrine, humans are still human, and fear still works the same way it always has. The bowman vanished from records, but not from consequence. And somewhere, in the forgotten margins of World War II, his truth remains. Not everything deadly belongs to the future. Not every victory needs witnesses. And sometimes, the weapon they mock is the one they never hear coming. War is usually remembered by explosions, by machines, by numbers carved into stone. But some victories leave no crater, no headline, no name to honor, only absence. The men who entered that forest believed they understood war. They trusted progress, steel, and noise. What they encountered instead was patience, silence, and a weapon older than their confidence. That is why this story survived, not because it was written down, but because it disturbed everyone who lived it. History doesn't always remember what was effective. It remembers what was comfortable, and the most dangerous lessons are often the ones left out. This is Dark War Records.